I don't know
When
what
my
to do.
CEO invited me into her penthouse that
It's
night,
okay, we'll figure
I
this
told
out together.
myself it was nothing, just a drink, just gratitude after work. But the moment the door closed behind us, I realized nothing about my life would ever feel the same again. It started like any other long day at the office. The kind of day where fluorescent lights hum overhead far past their welcome, and the city outside is already soaked in dusk by the time you finally push back from your desk. My eyes were burning from staring at spreadsheets, my shirt clinging a little too tightly from hours of sitting. I was gathering my things when her voice cut through the quiet, low, steady, unmistakable. Heading out already? I turned. There she was, framed in the glass doorway of her office. My CEO. Elena. 45 years old, immaculately composed as always, though her heels dangled loosely from one hand, her posture carrying a fatigue she would never show in a boardroom. Her blazer was off, silk blouse softened by the dim lights. She looked less like the untouchable executive everyone whispered about, and more like a woman who'd been carrying the weight of an empire all day. I managed a polite smile. Yeah. Just finishing up. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the carpet, her perfume a quiet thread of warmth in the sterile air. For a moment she studied me, like she was deciding something. Then her lips curved, half smile, almost private. You've worked hard today, she said. Come up with me. Share a drink. My place isn't far. Her words landed heavier than they should have. I blinked, unsure I'd heard right. She must have noticed the hesitation because her smile deepened, but her eyes held a seriousness that made my chest tighten. I don't invite many people, she added softly. The elevator ride was a blur. Just the two of us inside, mirrored walls reflecting a version of me that looked far more composed than I felt. I kept my hands in my pockets, trying to still their restlessness, while she leaned back against the rail, heels dangling by her side, head tilted slightly as if listening to some thought only she could hear. The hum of the elevator seemed louder than usual, my heart beat louder still. When the doors slid open, a rush of cool air greeted us. She led the way down a hushed hallway, her shoulders no longer carrying the rigid command of the office. At her door she paused, glanced back at me, and for a second I wondered if she was about to change her mind. But instead, she unlocked it, and with a quiet push, the world opened into her penthouse. I stepped inside slowly. Floor-to-ceiling windows spilled the city into the room, thousands of lights flickering like stars caught between glass and sky. Everything gleamed, polished marble, sleek furniture, art on the walls that I couldn't name but felt the weight of. And yet the first thing I noticed wasn't the luxury. It was the silence. A heavy, lived-in silence that clung to the place, as though it had grown used to her being alone. She set her heels by the door, finally barefoot, finally human. Then she turned to me, her expression softer than I'd ever seen. Welcome, she said, her voice quiet, almost fragile. And in that moment I knew, this wasn't about business. This was something else entirely. The first thing I noticed wasn't the wealth, it was the view. Her penthouse stretched open in front of me like a private gallery suspended above the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows spilled gold and blue from the skyline, the lights blinking like restless stars scattered below. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something floral, like a perfume that lingered long after it had been worn. Elena moved through the space with an ease that told me she belonged here, though there was something in her steps, unfastened, weary, that betrayed she rarely allowed herself to relax. She set her bag down on a sleek console table, walked straight into the kitchen without turning on any more lights. The city illuminated everything well enough, painting her in silhouette. Red or white? She asked, her voice carrying across the room as she reached for bottles resting on a polished counter. Red's fine, I said, though my throat was dry, not from thirst but from the strange weight of being here, in her private world. The sound of the cork easing out echoed louder than it should have in the quiet apartment. She poured carefully, then returned with 2 glasses, setting one in my hand. For a moment our fingers touched, just the faintest brush, but it sent a charge through me I tried to mask behind the rim of my glass. She crossed to the sofa, a long, modern piece facing the windows, and let herself sink into the cushions. She didn't sit like the CEO who commanded meetings. She sat like someone who had finally set down invisible armor. I noticed her sigh, soft and unguarded, as she slipped one leg beneath her and rested the glass on her knee. "You're staring," she said lightly, not looking at me but at the city. I blinked, heat rising in my face. "Sorry. It's the place. The view?" Her lips tilted upward, faint amusement playing there. "The view is better with company," she said, finally turning her head toward me. Her eyes caught the light from outside, reflecting tiny constellations. I lowered myself into the opposite end of the sofa, careful to keep some distance, though every part of me was aware of her presence. The faint rustle of her blouse as she shifted, the way her hair brushed against her shoulder when she tilted her head back. "Do you often bring people here?" I asked before I could stop myself. Her smile dimmed, thoughtful now. She swirled the wine slowly, her eyes fixed on it as though it held the answer. "Almost never," she admitted. Then softer. "It feels too revealing." The honesty in her tone caught me off guard. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed vulnerable, not the strategist, not the leader, but a woman alone in a space too large for one. I took a sip of wine, letting the warmth settle in my chest. "Then why me?" Her gaze found mine again. It lingered, longer than necessary, until the silence between us felt almost physical. Finally she spoke, her voice low, deliberate. "Because tonight," she said, "I didn't want to be alone." The city hummed below us, but in that moment, the penthouse felt like the quietest place in the world. The wine loosened the edges of the silence between us, but it didn't erase the tension, it only made it more noticeable. She sat angled toward the windows, the city's glow tracing along her cheekbones, while I shifted on the other end of the sofa, caught somewhere between comfort and nerves. At first, the conversation was simple, safe. Work. A project deadline. A joke about the malfunctioning elevator that had trapped 2 interns earlier in the week. She laughed at that, low and rich, her head tipping back for a moment. It was the kind of laugh I'd never heard from her in the office, unguarded, uncalculated. "You're different here," I said quietly before I could stop myself. Her smile faltered, though not in an unpleasant way. She set her glass down on the low table, fingers lingering at the rim. "And what am I at the office?" I hesitated, then answered honestly. "Untouchable. Like nothing gets to you." Her eyes flicked to mine, sharp for a moment, then softened as she leaned back against the sofa. She folded one arm loosely across her stomach, the other resting along the cushion between us. "That's the version of me people need to see. Otherwise," she trailed off, her gaze slipping toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Otherwise they think they can take more than I'm willing to give." Her words sat heavy in the air, laced with something deeper than corporate battles. I wanted to ask more, but instead I said, "And what about here? At home?" A quiet laugh escaped her, not light-hearted this time but edged with self-awareness. "Here I'm just a woman who sometimes forgets how lonely it can feel at the top." The honesty pulled something in me tighter. I wasn't sure if it was sympathy, admiration, or something harder to name. I turned my glass in my hands, watching the dark red swirl. "I don't think anyone would ever guess that about you." "That's the point," she replied softly. Her eyes lingered on me then, not boss to employee, but one human recognizing another. "I don't usually let people see this side." The weight of her admission pressed into me. I tried to steady my voice. "So why me?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and studied me as if she was trying to solve a question she hadn't asked out loud. Finally, she said, "Because you notice things. Most people don't." Her words landed deeper than I expected. I looked away, embarrassed by how much they mattered to me, how much it meant that she'd seen me, not just as an employee, but as someone worth inviting into her world. When I glanced back, she was still watching me. Her eyes didn't move away, not even when I caught them. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was charged, alive, something stretching taut between us. She broke it with a half-smile, leaning back again, her hand drifting idly along the sofa cushion. "Careful," she murmured, her tone lighter but her eyes saying otherwise. "If I talk too much, I'll forget this is supposed to be just a drink." And yet the way she looked at me told me it already wasn't just a drink. It was something neither of us had words for yet. The city outside kept flickering, steady and indifferent, while inside her penthouse, the air had thickened, like the silence itself had become aware of us. We were still sitting apart on the sofa, though not as far apart as before. Somewhere in the last half hour, the distance had shortened without either of us mentioning it. My glass was nearly empty, hers forgotten on the table, the condensation sliding down its stem. She looked relaxed in a way I'd never seen, one knee drawn up, her elbow resting lazily against the back of the sofa. But her eyes hadn't relaxed once. She was watching me, even when she pretended not to. "You don't say much," she said finally, her voice softer than before, almost probing. I shrugged, running my thumb against the edge of my glass. "I'd rather listen. People, reveal more when you do." That drew a smile from her, not the practiced, professional curve of her lips I'd seen in meetings, but something slower, more genuine. "Dangerous skill to have," she murmured. "You'll end up knowing people better than they want you to." "Maybe," I said. "But I think people want to be known. Deep down." Her expression changed, just slightly, but enough to make my chest tighten. Vulnerability flickered across her features, quickly masked. She looked away, out toward the skyline, and for a moment I thought the conversation had slipped too close to something she wasn't ready to touch. But then, almost casually, she shifted. Her hand, elegant, steady, rested against the sofa between us. I didn't move. My arm was already there, my hand curled loosely near my knee. And then, without hesitation, her fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't bold. Not a declaration. Just the lightest connection, her fingertips grazing my knuckles, lingering for a breath longer than they needed to. But the effect was immediate, like static jumping across a line. I felt my pulse leap. My skin seemed to register nothing else but that touch, soft, deliberate, careful. I glanced at her, and she was already watching me, her expression unreadable except for the faintest crease near her lips, like she knew exactly what she'd done and wasn't planning to explain it. I didn't pull away. Couldn't. Instead, I let my hand turn slightly, letting her fingertips slide into my palm. The motion was so subtle, but it felt enormous, like crossing an invisible line neither of us had dared to step over until now. Her breath caught, quiet but audible. Then, almost as if realizing the moment had stretched too long, she withdrew, her hand lifting back to her glass. "Thank you," she said suddenly, as though to cover the silence. "For tonight. For being here." The words were simple, but her voice carried something else, something unspoken, wrapped tightly beneath layers of restraint. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my tone steady. "You don't have to thank me." Her eyes flicked to mine again. They held. And in that glance I knew, it wasn't the drink she'd wanted, or the company, it was the closeness. A closeness she'd denied herself until tonight. The moment her hand slipped away, the room seemed to breathe again, but differently. I sat frozen, my pulse still racing from the brush of her fingers. She sipped her wine as if nothing had happened, but her gaze betrayed her, steady, searching, filled with something she didn't quite let free. For a long while either of us spoke. The city outside filled the silence, cars streaming through the veins of streets below, a distant siren cutting across the hum. Her penthouse was quiet except for the soft tick of a clock on the far wall. And yet the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, brimming with words unsaid. Finally, she broke it. "You're too young for this," she said, her voice calm but tight, as if she'd rehearsed the thought before. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed on the window, her reflection faint against the glass. "Too young to spend your evenings with someone like me." Her words landed like a quiet verdict. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to speak. "Someone like you?" She let out a soft laugh, though it held no real amusement. A woman who should know better. At last she turned to me, and I caught the flicker of vulnerability in her expression, the kind she'd never let slip in daylight. There's nearly 20 years between us. Do you know what people would say if they knew you were here? I leaned forward, my glass forgotten on the table. I don't care what people would say. Her brows knit slightly, as though testing whether I meant it. You should. The firmness in her tone didn't match her body language. Her arms weren't crossed in defense. They rested open at her sides, her shoulders faintly slouched, as if she was tired of carrying the walls she'd built. Her voice said push me away, but everything else about her whispered the opposite. I don't think age makes this any less real, I said carefully, searching her face for a sign of what she truly felt. I think sometimes it makes it more so. Because you know exactly what you want. And my voice faltered, then steadied. I know what I feel. Her lips parted as if to answer, but she didn't. Instead, she stared at me for a long, weighted pause, as though my words had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling. You make it sound simple, she said at last, her voice almost a whisper. Maybe it is, I replied. That made her smile again, small, reluctant, but warmer this time. She shook her head lightly, as though dismissing me, but her eyes lingered. And though she didn't reach for me again, the air between us had shifted, no longer a question of if, but of when. Time slipped by unnoticed. The wine glasses stood half empty, the city's glow shifting as midnight crept closer. Neither of us said it was late, but the quiet rhythms of the night began to press in, reminding me that the world outside still existed. I set my glass down, letting the pause linger before I spoke. I should probably go. Her eyes flicked to me, quick, almost startled, though her expression smoothed before I could fully read it. She nodded, but slowly, as though agreeing with words she didn't want to hear. Rising from the sofa, she moved with her usual grace, but there was something restrained in it, like she was pulling a curtain back over whatever had passed between us. I followed her to the door. The walk felt longer than it should have, every step accompanied by the muffled hum of the city far below. She stopped at the threshold, her hand resting on the doorframe, her body angled slightly toward me. For a moment, it felt like the natural end, thank you, goodbye, the night dissolving back into memory. But neither of us moved. The silence gathered again, heavier this time, charged with everything we hadn't said. She looked at me, really looked, her eyes searching as though she was trying to memorize my face. The kind of gaze that made my chest feel tight, as though something permanent was shifting. You should get some rest, she murmured, but her voice was softer than her words, carrying none of the finality they implied. I nodded, but my feet didn't step forward. Instead, I found myself standing still, close enough to notice the faint trace of perfume at her collarbone, the slight rise and fall of her breath. Then she moved, slowly, deliberately. One hand lifted, hesitant at first, until her fingers brushed lightly against my forehead. She tucked a stray strand of hair back, her knuckles grazing my temple in the gentlest motion. It wasn't much. A simple gesture. But her touch lingered longer than it needed to, her hand trailing down until her palm rested against my cheek. Warm. Steady. Intimate in a way that made words feel unnecessary. I closed my eyes briefly, leaning into it before I could think better of it. My heart thudded against my ribs, each beat loud in the quiet space between us. When I opened my eyes again, she was still there, her face inches from mine, her expression caught somewhere between restraint and surrender. Neither of us leaned in further. Either of us spoke. But in that suspended moment, everything felt decided, without a kiss, without a word. Finally, with a soft inhale, she pulled her hand back, letting the space return between us. Her lips curved into the faintest, almost apologetic smile. "Good night," she whispered. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to steady. "Good night." As the door clicked softly behind me, the city air felt sharper, brighter, as though the night had shifted into something entirely new. The hallway outside her penthouse was still, almost too still, as if the air itself knew what had just passed between us. The soft click of her door closing echoed in my chest louder than it should have, a sound that seemed to seal the night into memory. I stood there for a few seconds, my hand brushing over the railing of the hallway, trying to steady myself. My heart was still racing, not from what had happened exactly, but from what hadn't. The closeness. The touch on my cheek. The words left unsaid but heavy in the silence. The elevator carried me back down to the ground floor, its mirrored walls throwing my reflection back at me. I looked the same as I had when I'd gone up, rumpled shirt, tired eyes, but something was different. I could feel it. Like some hidden current had shifted direction, and nothing could return to the way it was before. When I stepped out into the night air, the city was alive in its usual restless way, cars gliding down slick streets, neon signs buzzing faintly, laughter spilling from a bar across the corner. But it all felt sharper, more vivid, as though her presence still clung to me, tinting everything in its glow. Even the air carried her perfume lingering faintly on my jacket, a reminder I couldn't shake. I walked slowly, not rushing to get anywhere. My mind replayed every detail, the sound of her laughter, the way her voice dropped when she admitted she didn't want to be alone, the warmth of her hand against mine. And that last moment, her palm resting against my cheek, the way her eyes had softened, as though she'd allowed herself to be seen in a way she never did with anyone else. It hadn't been a kiss. But somehow, it felt like more. Because it wasn't physical closeness that had unsettled me most, it was the emotional one. The way she'd let down her guard. The way she'd chosen me, even for just an evening, to step inside the walls she so carefully kept. I thought of her final words, whispered like a secret. Good night. They hadn't sounded like an ending. They had sounded like a beginning she wasn't ready to name yet. As I turned down my street, the city still humming around me, I knew this night wouldn't leave me. Tomorrow, we'd return to the office, and she'd wear her armor again, heels clicking, voice steady, presence commanding. And I would be just another face in her orbit. But something had changed. Between us. Inside me. Inside her. It wasn't just that I'd seen her penthouse, her world, her solitude. It was that she'd let me in, not only to her home, but to a part of herself she kept hidden from everyone else. And as I reached my door, sliding the key into the lock, a quiet certainty settled over me. Nothing was the same again. Sparkles. This gives the story its quiet but transformative ending, closing the arc while leaving space for the audience to feel that the real journey is just beginning.